Institute for Public. Uh, this is a combination, a team effort of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs at Cal State LA, Southern California Edison, which has been both a partner and has provided support for this, and the SELA Collaborative. And I am going to be back on stage soon as we begin our conversation, but I want to turn it over for a welcome to Larry Chung, who's the Vice President for Local Public Affairs at Southern California Edison. And I've told everybody we're on a first name basis here, so it's Rafe passing it over to Larry. So Larry, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rafe. I appreciate that. And a big thank you to the Pat Brown Institute and the SELA Collaborative for co-hosting this important webinar today. I'm really pleased to join you all this morning. I have the honor of introducing my good friend, Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon this morning. But before I do, I would like to take a brief moment to share a little bit about the work that we're doing at Southern California Edison and how it aligns with the vision of our great state of California and how it impacts SELA specifically. Edison, we envision a world where homes and businesses, as well as cars, trucks, and mass transit are powered by carbon-free electricity. It's a future where all communities, regardless of ethnicity, background, or income level, can breathe cleaner air. It's a future filled with tremendous opportunity for California's economy in the form of clean transportation and clean energy jobs. And we want a future that provides an affordable clean energy future for all Californians. To make that future a reality, we have to act with unprecedented urgency and commitment. And it's because we have elected leaders like Anthony Rendon that we're able to advance the work to realize that clean energy future for everyone. So for our part, Edison is investing more than $800 million to build electric vehicle charging infrastructure for cars, trucks, buses, and other equipment, as well as offering rewards and rebates to help customers transition to EVs. We also partner with diverse community stakeholders to help inform our customer offerings to ensure that underrepresented communities are included in the clean energy transition. One of these offerings is our Charge Ready Transport program. As you all know, transportation accounts for almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions in California. This problem is especially acute in communities along heavily used transportation corridors, like those communities along the 710 freeway. Charge Ready Transport was designed with this exact concern in mind, as medium and heavy duty vehicles are the largest mobile sources of air pollution. So transitioning those vehicles to zero emission electric vehicles will really lead to greater gains in air pollution reduction. The program helps customers install the charging infrastructure to support medium and heavy duty electric vehicles at low or no cost to the customer. And our goal is to support over 8,000 medium and heavy duty electric vehicles across our 50,000 square mile service area, including transit buses and industrial vehicles. With Speaker Rendon here today, I'm really happy to share that we currently have 9 active and completed projects in Southeast LA and the Port of Long Beach, comprising 354 charging ports that support the electrification of 95 medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as almost 300 transportation refrigeration units. And while these projects reduce emissions and improve local air quality, we really have a lot more to do. And we're eager to work with you to build the solutions and infrastructure needed to reduce emissions, to create a carbon neutral economy and improve the quality of life in our communities. So please consider Edison as your partner, as we are today for this webinar, because we have common goals and we need to work together. And there's so much to be gained from partnerships, which is just one of the reasons why we're really proud to partner with PBI and SELA Collaborative, and so many of you who do this important work, organizing our communities and fighting for our clean energy future. So a big thanks to all the participants who are on today as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that Speaker Rendon was a really good friend, but he really is an even better community advocate. He's a tireless champion, especially for our Southland communities. And under Speaker Rendon's leadership, the Assembly has conducted some of the most progressive and productive legislative sessions in memory. I can't call out all of his accomplishments because we'd probably take the entire program, but I do want to highlight just a few. He's led the restoration of funding for early childhood education, for example. He secured a landmark $52 billion transportation funding plan. He has fought for the extension of California's climate change reduction and clean air goals, including dozens of sweeping bills enacted this year alone as part of the legislative climate change package. And of course, this year's state budget that will make historic investments to accelerate an equitable transition to a clean energy future. I personally think what's made him so effective is that he's never lost sight of who he is and why he pursued public service in the first place. He's always listened to Californians. He's always fought for those who need it the most. We're really fortunate to have his leadership in Sacramento, and I'm really happy that he was reelected as Speaker for the coming legislative term. I could not be more honored to introduce him this morning. So please join me in welcoming our Assembly Speaker, Anthony Rendon.
Cool. Thanks, Larry. Good to see you. Rafe said we're all on a first name basis, so I'll refer to Rafe as Rafe. He'll refer to me as Anthony, but Larry should refer to me as Your Excellency, which he didn't do. But otherwise, a fine introduction, Larry. Yeah, I appreciate that. Good to see you, Larry. Good to see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of friends that we've had around SELA for a while. Obviously, Dr. Wilma Franco is somebody who we work with in my office probably 365 days a year, whether it's on environmental issues. Obviously, we work so hard together on census issues and making sure that we get the representation we deserve in Southeast LA. I know Cudahy Mayor Liz Alcantar is also on the Zoom, a true hero, one of my role models here in Southeast LA. Having Liz here and doing what she does, which is to lead and to hold folks accountable, is important as well. I also want to thank Larry and the folks over at Edison. You know, in order to sort of realize the green future that we're talking about, it's through collaborations, it's through those types of partnerships that we need. So thanks for that. But finally, I want to thank the Pat Brown Institute. Rafe, full disclosure, Rafe is a longtime friend and a former colleague of mine. When we were on faculty together at Cal State Fullerton. There's a lot of people in politics who talk about stuff. I have a lot of meetings in my office, and a lot of people make promises. And to be really honest with you, 8 out of 10 people don't keep their promises. They come and they say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and nothing comes of it. Rafe came to my office early on, not only early on during my speakership, but early on during my tenure as an assembly member. And we started talking about Southeast LA, and he said, what can we do at PBI? And they have done everything we've asked of them and more. There has been no more important community partner than PBI. They are constantly looking out for SELA. So they are really, I think, one of the unsung heroes that we have in our state. So thanks, Rafe, and thanks to your whole crew. This topic today is obviously really important and something that's close to my heart. I think it's important for several reasons. First of all, this is a topic that's been important to me for years, not only as an elected official, but when I worked in early childhood education and gang programs in Southeast LA, we started to understand early on the sort of nexus between the air people were breathing and the lives they lived, the soil beneath them and the lives they lived, the water they were drinking and the lives they lived. It's the sort of, hardcore sort of tangible aspects of the environment that really ultimately has an impact on people's lives in ways that we didn't always realize at the outset. So the environment is obviously a hugely important issue to me. Another reason I talked about Dr. Franco and I talked about Liz, but the high caliber of the participants are really important to me from top to bottom. These are folks I've worked with for years and people I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And the remaining participants are all people who deserve to be heard. So I'm glad so many folks have joined this Zoom today. And that's why I want to keep my introduction short. I want to make sure that these people get their say. I suspect that a lot of people on this Zoom already have an understanding of the issue. The basic concept is one of environmental justice or environmental equity, when I was the executive director of the California League of Conservation Voters, we had this organization called Green California. And Green California was this consortium of environmental groups from all over the state. There were probably about 30 of us that were packed into this room on a quarterly basis. And the head of the California League of Conservation Voters is the facilitator of Green California, brings sort of this United Nations of environmental groups together. And I remember facilitating my first meeting and looking in this crowded room of 30 people, and there was not anybody for the environmental justice movement. And I said, my next meeting of Green California, we're going to invite the EJ folks. And I did. And the room went from, 30 to 50. It went from crowded to very crowded. And what I always remember was there was someone sitting next to me, and there was a lot of yelling and a lot of tension that had been built up over the decades. And there were, everybody was in the same room together. And I remember people were yelling. It was very intense. I remember the person next to me saying, I think you made a mistake. And I said, no, I think we made a mistake 30 years ago when we didn't convene this group, when we didn't bring these people together. That's when we made our mistake. What happens in democracy is often these arguments. What happens in democracy is often tension-filled. What happens in democracy is often about people demanding to be heard. And that's what today is, to a large extent. Today, this is SELA saying our environmental issues are relevant and important, and we demand to be heard. And we've been doing that over the course of the past decade, I think at a very high level, and want to continue to do that. And this is a venue for doing so. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm not going to call you Your Excellency. I'm sorry. I've just known you too long to do that. Anthony Rendon is an example of something I tell my students when they say that they someday want to run for office. My advice to them is don't do it first. First, serve the community in a way that's outside public office. And I think that so much of Anthony's work as speaker has been influenced by the work he did before he ran for public office in the first place. And I think that's really what makes an outstanding public official. And he has been a tremendous friend of the Southeast LA community. We've all been friends together in this process. The Pat Brown Institute got called into Southeast LA by local philanthropy and the speaker and others to bring the resources of a university to the community. And too often universities are in ivory towers. And we felt instantly that it was the right place for us to be. And ever since, we've been members of the SELA Collaborative, one of the great achievements of Southeast LA, getting its voice out there. We've conducted polling and surveys of the community that had never been surveyed before, and helped working with Wilma and our fellow board members to elevate the voice of Southeast LA. And the purpose of this event is to take that to another level. It has always been a concern that as funding becomes available in these important environmental and infrastructure areas, that SELA not be bypassed, that basically the way the system often works is that funding goes to the big cities, the big counties, and then everybody else is on their own. One of my first days in Southeast LA, I stood at one corner of Southeast LA and realized I could see LA City Hall from there. And I had the feeling, the odd feeling, that it was so close and yet so far away, being in SELA around the large, powerful metropolises to get their voice heard. And now it's starting to happen. And today is really part of that. We have a wonderful panel of people, and it's not going to be speeches. No one's been asked to prepare anything except for a conversation. And I'm going to lead a conversation that essentially talks about all this infrastructure funding, all the energy funding, all the exciting work that Edison and others are doing in the area of electrification. What does it mean for the communities of Southeast LA? And not only how can the communities get access to funding, but this funding will in its own way shape and reshape the communities. And if there's one thing the EJ movement has proven above all, and you'll hear from them today, is how it's reshaped has to have the voices of the community at the table. So we're going to be talking all the way from the top to the community level. and our four guests. And I think I would like to ask all four of you to put your cameras on because we will be doing some back and forth among us. We have our first conversation will be with LaQuinn Nguyen, who is the Deputy Secretary for Energy of the California Natural Resources Agency. Thank you for joining us. We had to have, because of urgent things going on in her department, she's coming in quickly, but I think she's going to jump right in and we're going to be just fine. We have Elizabeth Alcantar, who's the mayor of Cudahy. Welcome. So glad to have you here with us. Also, since, as you may not know, most city council members and mayors in this region work part-time as elected officials, although it never feels like part-time. Feels like full-time, right? It's pretty much. But she also has a very important role at CHIRLA, one of the most noted activist organizations in the region. Rosalie Barcinas, Director, Electrification and Customer Services Policy for Southern California Edison. Rosalie, thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you here. And Jocelyn Del Real, Energy Policy Organizer from East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. If you don't know East Yard, you got to know East Yard. East Yard has probably been the most dynamic environmental justice organization, not only in South LA, but perhaps throughout the region, and nationally known for their work in environmental justice. So I'm going to start. I have some questions for you, LaQuinn, if you don't mind. And especially because you're jumping in on such short notice, don't worry, it won't be a quiz. We're very interested in, first of all of us getting up to speed on what is this thing called the IIJA. You know, initials leave us all completely baffled. What is the IIJA and what does it mean for communities like Southeast LA?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, Ray, thank you for having me here. Thank you for putting me in the hot seat first.
I thought that would be more fun since you were coming in cold.
Yeah. Yeah, so lots of acronyms floating around lately. So IIJA stands for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's also referred to sometimes as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so that's basically it's a $1.2 trillion bill that President Biden signed last year that provides funding for transportation and infrastructure. So that includes things such as, you know, resilience, transmission, basically a lot of things that I love to hear about from my energy perspective at the Resources Agency. And so this is huge for California. I mean, so I'll get to the question about how this is good for communities like SELA, but really big for California in general, right? This is on top of our huge climate budget that that the governor and the legislature, passed earlier this year. So that was 54 billion, right? And so really hoping that we can leverage the IIJA funds, you know, with our efforts. And so this is really important for Californians as a whole. You know, in California, we have these really ambitious climate and energy goals, and it's going to take a lot of, you know, work to get there. And it's work that we can do, right? But it means like bringing on additional clean energy resources, but also making sure that it's done in like an affordable and equitable way, which I think has been a really big focus of, like I said, the administration and the legislature. So this funding, again, will help us just leverage and make sure that California's funding goes even farther, right? Which is a benefit to ratepayers and all Californians. And then even just going back to like your more specific question, I know you're probably wishing I wasn't on your panel now.
No, because you're the authority on the scope of this funding, which is just unbelievable. But you did say, by the way, you did say trillion, didn't you? That wasn't like a typo, right?
It was 1.2 trillion.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining that. Okay.
Yeah. And not going to all of California, of course. You know, right. California has an opportunity to get some of this funding. And you know, like there's different types of funding that we can compete for, some that will automatically go to the states for, you know, dispersal. But again, this is really big for, you know, communities like SELA because within that infrastructure bill, there's a Justice 40 component where they hope that of some of those funds, 40% will benefit, under-resourced, disadvantaged communities. And as I mentioned before, I see a really big, increased acknowledgement, focus on making sure we're doing this clean energy transition in an equitable, affordable way. So people really understand that, we need to make sure that we're not implementing this in a way that leaves people behind, that we're really incorporating other communities like perspectives and making sure like everybody has an opportunity to compete for this funds.
So let me ask you a few follow-up questions.
Yeah.
1 out of 8 people in this country live in California. So how much of this amount of money is probably going to end up, and then I have questions, how does it go from California to communities, but how much of it is going to come to us in California? And is that something we all have to fight for? Or is that something that, as you said, some of it's already allocated, some of it'll be competitive, right?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how much will go to California, right? We have the opportunity to get billions of dollars. I mean, and you're like, okay, well, that means nothing, right? 1.2 trillion. I don't know how many billions of dollars. I've heard numbers such as like, well, we have the opportunity at like 65 billion of that, 1.2 trillion. I'm not sure, but the funding breaks down in 2 ways. There's the formulaic funding and the competitive funding. So the formulaic funding is, California will get X% of a certain category of funding. So for example, on the transportation side, there was like, that was formulaic funding where there was a set number of like millions that California got from that overall transportation infrastructure funding. But then there's also this competitive funding where we'll have to apply for that. So for example, the Department of Energy, they have hydrogen hubs that they had a competitive opportunity for. And so we actually had to apply for that, for the opportunity to get that funding. And like California was fortunate enough, we got through phase 1, but again, like that's competitive funding where we won't know for sure if we'll get it until, yeah. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Does every penny of this money pass through Sacramento, or does any of it go directly to cities and counties? And example being small cities in Southeast LA.
Yeah, I mean, some of it will go directly to cities, counties in terms of, the state or California cannot be the, for some of these funding opportunities, the state or California will not be the one applying for that. I'm thinking about another effort that, has been brought to my attention more recently on another topic I work on, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So through DOE, there's also a direct air capture hub opportunity. And again, that's, there's the opportunity for millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to come to California if we get one of these direct air capture hubs. But the state of California cannot be the applicant. It needs to be, project proponent. So it would be possibly, I think of like a private developer, like in coordination with, a community college district, applying for that funding. But like, again, in that instance, it would go to whoever the project proponents are. So it could be, in that case, like the community college district, it could be the county, it could be a smaller group, but that wouldn't be the state in that instance. Okay.
So then let's take the money that goes through the state. I'm not challenging too much, except the state is a colossus. Okay. And colossuses are very good at dealing with other colossuses, like the, say, 15 largest cities, the largest counties. And there does often seem to be a tradition of a lot of the funding that passes through the state. Well, it's easier for a big city like LA or Oakland or Long Beach to put together an application for that funding than it is for one of the cities or a consortium of cities in Southeast LA. Have you been giving thought in Sacramento to how to make sure that there's a real shot for places that are not the biggest cities and counties in the state to get a decent share for things that they want to accomplish?
Yeah, that's the short answer is yes. Lots of thought behind this. I mean, again, I use this term about a, equitable, affordable transition, and it seems like it could be, just another catchphrase, but it's not, right? I think everybody is really putting effort behind that and trying to meaningfully think through how we actually do that. So there has been a lot of thought behind this. I speak more from the energy perspective, even though this is happening throughout all levels of, state government, but that's why mine will be more about like the energy side. But with the energy, like with the agencies that I work with, that has been an increasing focus. Again, reliability has been a big part of my job. And so we're really thinking through again, like how this is impacting, these under-resourced communities if we have, like the ratepayer impacts. So there are a few things that we're doing. We are, as we develop the grant solicitations, these are always an open process where we ask for input. And in some cases, we're targeting, under-resourced communities or targeting local governments. So for example, we might have a carve out or set aside for tribes, or, we might say that we'll give you, when we score your proposal, we might give you additional points or preference points if you, are serving or benefiting an under-resourced community. The other thing that we've been trying to do a lot of over the past, year and a half is listening sessions in the different regions of California, because it's really important, again, to understand that not every community will have the same needs, concerns, right? The concern from somebody in Southern California will not necessarily be the same focus, priority concern in Northern California. So really trying to, do listening sessions throughout the state to understand what those community needs are. And then depending on like the grant or the funding opportunity, really trying to tailor that opportunity towards, those communities. I mean, you also mentioned technical assistance, or you alluded to that, right? In terms of some of these larger cities, counties being able to submit these applications that are really well put together because they have that staffing or, that experience. And that's something that we also recognize is an issue. So we're trying to think through, how we address that and what we can do, and really would welcome feedback from, my fellow panelists or, the audience as to suggestions on, increasing our attentiveness to these communities and, making sure that we're giving them the proper resources they need to be competitive for our competitive grants.
Well, thank you. That's a great introduction and a good opportunity to bring on the panelists to address those very questions. So I want to switch now to Mayor Alcantar, because this is a great opening to ask you a bunch of questions. We've been now starting in Sacramento, kind of looking down, and now we're in Southeast LA looking up, in the shadow of the big city of LA and the county of LA. What's your sense of, with this huge opportunity out there, what's necessary for Southeast LA to be able to really participate at the highest possible level? And welcome, by the way. So glad that you could join us.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for bringing on our Southeast cities. For our Southeast cities, there has to be several things that happen, and it was touched on, but technical assistance. Our staff size is incredibly small. It's as small as some of our nonprofits that are also dealing with technical assistance needs. Even when we partner on grant opportunities, it's one of the big issues, right? Who is applying? How are we managing even the funds if we do get them? But the entire application process is a whole process for us as small cities, where sometimes our full-time staff is as small as 10 or 12 people. And that includes public works, that includes our city manager who's overlooking everything. It does not just include folks that are looking out for dollars and trying to bring projects to our city. But the second is that our Southeast cities do need to work regionally. And we're starting to see that a lot more now. It started with COVID and seeing the huge need that there was in our Southeast cities for just getting basic resources that other cities were getting and frankly not utilizing as much as our residents were begging for those resources. And so we started that collaboration then. We're looking at further collaboration. I think grant opportunities is exactly where we should go to next. We are a bunch of small cities. It's not just Cudahy, but it's Bell, it's Maywood, right? Which all have similar population and geographic sizes and similar needs. And a lot of the time we already collaborate or have the same contracts. We just have them all separate, and so that costs us more. We can translate that same thought process to grant opportunities where we're all fighting for the same dollars, and thus none of us get them. But then the third piece is the governor's office should absolutely be looking at setting aside funds for communities like ours. EJ communities deserve funds set aside for them specifically.
Can I pursue that? That's three really great points. And, I'm not going to call you mayor because I didn't call the speaker. So
yeah, no, Liz or Elizabeth is fine.
All right. We sometimes get opportunities to apply for government grants or contracts, and we're a small organization in our university, it's too hard. You know, it's just impossible. I mean, the requirements that go into the application. So, I mean, you think a little bit about whether funds should be put aside, but also procedures put aside that are
Right.
accessible and are designed for a relatively small city or several cities. Is that something that would be, I mean, I know that's asking a lot of the state and the feds, but there are times when you got to come halfway.
Right, precisely. And you're right. There has to be those procedural issues set aside for small cities. And I'm not just saying small cities, but it's small cities that serve populations that are
Right.
with less resources, less funding, et cetera. A lot of the time we get told, oh, well, there's this other application for technical assistance. That's great, but now we have to add on another application. And so is it really that much less work? You know, it's these processes that I think make sense at a higher level. But once you start getting down to the meat of the things that you're trying to get into, you start seeing that it's so much more difficult to apply for a technical assistance grant in order to apply for the grant. They're both add on more work for, again, limited staff.
And there's also issues about how reporting is required,
Right.
and the staffs that the big cities have for reporting, literally doing reporting. What's it like? Now, I'm not asking you for inside information about the intersection of things. You've got a lot of cities there that are only now really looking at working at a regional level. And this seems like it's pretty urgent right now. What do you have to overcome so that Cudahy, Bell, the other cities are all going to feel comfortable reaching out to the governor's office or even the White House with a sort of common vision?
Right, and Cudahy and our neighboring cities, we've already started that work on different issues. The big thing to tackle here is that we are meant to do this on every single issue. And so we did that for COVID. We reached out to the governor's office. The governor's office was able to provide, starting off with, I believe, 200 vaccination appointments with the SELA Collaborative, and all these other folks worked on as well. And we reached out to the White House on this topic as well. But now we need to times 10, times 20 that into EJ, into EJ as a whole, but energy efficiency and sustainability and all these different issues. And so I think at the governor's office and several of our state agencies need to also, like you said, meet in the middle with us, reach out to Southeast communities. We know we've been loud and clear about what our needs are. And it's not just on the city side, but even with our nonprofits. Environmental justice, or EJ, Eastern Communities for Environmental Justice, has been incredible in really letting folks know, like, we are here and we need these resources. CBE as well has been great at being loud and clear about it. SELA cities. And so at this point, there is no room for pretending that they don't know. At this point, we need to acknowledge that we're here. We have these needs, even from Air Quality Management District, AQMD. For 30 years, we dealt with the smells coming from rendering plants in our neighboring city. 30 years, and we were still expected as residents, as city agencies, to call every single time we smelled it, which is every single day in the morning and every single evening as well. We're expected to call every time, but we know that the agency knows. So why are we putting the brunt of the work on the residents? It's a similar idea of, why are we putting the brunt of the work on these tiny cities with budgets smaller than some of our nonprofits, instead of saying, we're actively reaching out, we know what the issues are, here's the funding and here's the process.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. One last question. When you look at all this infrastructure and climate funding coming in, are there needs that you think are the most urgent in Southeast LA that it ought to be on the top of the list to make sure that those flows come, rather than just a dollar amount? Are there things in it that you think would really make a very big difference in the daily lives of people?
In the daily lives of people. I mean, when it comes to infrastructure, there's so many needs that we have, but two of them are in terms of transportation. Infrastructure, transportation, environmental justice, all commingle so much. And for us, I know several of us have been working on the 710 corridor, which we know is not going to be, seen as an extension of the 710 or expansion, but more so projects along the corridor. We need those projects funded, specifically in Southeast Los Angeles. And then, of course, the West Santa branch. That would mean so much for the daily lives of our residents if we were to adequately fund it. But we're being told constantly left and right that, well, that project is behind schedule. That project is out of budget already. If we keep pursuing it now, it's going to get further out of budget. But the reality is that it's out of budget and it's off behind schedule because we haven't funded it. We were supposed to be funded in my Measure R, and we were told to wait and be put aside for wealthier, frankly, whiter communities on the west side. And now we're being told to wait again for other communities on the other side of the county. And that's what we need to remember when we talk about we're funding equity. We cannot keep saying equity for the sake of saying equity. If we're saying equity, we need to fund it. And that means funding projects in Southeast Los Angeles that account for, that make sure that we're getting true justice in our communities, whether it's transit justice or environmental justice. We need it here in SELA.
Thank you very much for all these comments, Elizabeth. This is just great. I'm going to turn to Rosalie from Edison. Once again, Director of Electrification and Customer Services Policies for Southern California Edison. What's your take on what you've heard so far in terms of how Edison might be able to partner with nonprofits and cities and others, not as an exclusive thing, I mean, because there's lots of different paths forward, but how do you see the possibility of a relationship developing?
Well, I think it's definitely critical, right? Even the conversation we're having here, the different perspectives, this collaboration, this conversation about what the needs are from each of the parties is critical in order for us to be successful in this clean energy transition. And we often, partner with our local communities and not just our cities, but also community-based organizations to better understand the needs of the individual areas, but also to help educate on some of the programs that we might, have available. So I think the partnership is definitely a critical one as we move forward.
So when you think about cities like Cudahy and others and community organizations applying for some of this infrastructure funding, is there a vehicle to do that together, to collaborate on that, or is that off the table?
I think it's dependent on the type of project. So, we actually launched a program earlier this year where we're working with large fleet owners to help them apply for grants, for electric vehicle grants. So we're trying to provide services, technical services where we have them available. We also in our programs are designing them, to make sure that they have a focus on those communities that are most impacted by, for example, our transportation corridors, right? The 710, the 10 freeways. And so in our Charge Ready programs that was mentioned this morning, in our other building electrification programs that we have proposed at the Public Utilities Commission, we do carve out a focus for our communities that are most impacted. And so, we try to find partnerships in that way by identifying funding specific for these areas.
How complicated are these funding applications? I mean, we're hearing a lot about that so far in our conversation. Is it a reasonable level of difficulty? Is it daunting that if you don't have a whole team of people able to put full time into it to be able to actually compete and pursue?
And this is for the state and federal funding specifically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would, look to, LaQuinn, to help us understand what those applications look like.
So LaQuinn, what are those? You can tell everybody wants to see, are these going to be so daunting that at a certain point, if you're not a city of, say, 1 million or more people, you just walk away?
Well, it's hard to
talk
say,
about
right?
Putting you on the hot seat. How about that for things that haven't even been written yet?
I mean, the intent is not to make these applications daunting, and so it's hard to say because there's a lot still to come. And a lot of these, sometimes like when like the way they're written is because there's a lot of requirements or strings tied to this funding, right? And so it's hard for me to say it won't be daunting. Our intent is for it not to be daunting and to make it as easy as possible. The points that Elizabeth made earlier about, the technical assistance, like needing technical assistance just to apply for another, grant, like that really resonates with me. And it's something that we don't want to have happen, right? I mean, if our goal is to get, if we're trying to target funding towards, under-resourced communities or communities that typically don't, aren't able to compete for our funding, we can't make it so difficult that they're automatically disqualified just on like the paperwork alone, right? And so I don't really have a short answer. I mean, I don't really have a good answer other than to say our intent is not to make it daunting. But if there's solutions, again, for how we can make this easier, like I welcome that conversation. Like I said, I wrote down a bunch of the things that Elizabeth said. I'm going to definitely pass that on to my colleagues at some of the other agencies who I know will be implementing some of these grant opportunities, like the Energy Commission, right? To talk about, how we can combine some of these efforts, how we can, again, just bring this to the community and really identify like what do they need, how should these these grant opportunities be structured, right? The reporting requirements, I heard that one also as being very onerous. So thinking through like what can we do to make it easier for people to put forward good projects and get the work done, but without making it so tedious that they're just discouraged from applying.
That's a great answer, LaQuinn, because this is the first of many conversations. This is not the only conversation to be had. And I think you're being very receptive to what you're hearing from people about, to talk it through. No problem like this really can't be solved. One of the questions, go ahead, Rosalie. Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add on to that, in thinking about partnership and, applying for some of this funding.
You're breaking up a
area
little
where
bit
Edison
there,
can
Rosalie.
definitely help too when it comes to. Okay, is this any better? Hopefully.
That's better. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One area where Edison can definitely help and does help is partnering and understanding what the cities may need as it relates to infrastructure, right? So that's an important part of having a successful application is understanding what is needed when it comes to charging infrastructure or electric vehicle needs, or the electric needs to supply that demand that would be coming as well. So that's definitely where we can help in that advisory service.
Well, that's very helpful because we received a question, and feel free to put your questions in Q&A, which is if you're part of a small nonprofit and you'd like to work with Edison or others to collaborate, is there a name or something that could be posted on the Q&A that people could see, or just a way to make contact, just to sort of start a conversation about what some of those needs are?
Yeah. We'll get that answered and
Okay.
have that in the Q&A.
That'd be great. Okay, well, thank you, Rosalie. I'm going to turn now to Jocelyn from East Yard. Welcome again, Jocelyn. I'm so glad that you could join us. We've talked a lot about how good it would be to have resources come in and all the changes that can be made. But one of the things that East Yard has really put on the table again and again is that how things are shaped by communities is as important as the volume of resources that comes in. And if it just is a volume, there's no telling where it goes. So my question for you would be, how can the community and the community's advocates play a really good role in this, in kind of shaping? Obviously, time is short and a lot of things are going to have to move quickly, but there's always time to work that through. So what are your thoughts, Jocelyn, of what you've heard so far?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think, quite frankly, and like the theme of all this conversation, right, is about around a green future, right? And I think that, quite frankly, a green future does not exist without community's involvement. It is necessary to make space for it and to make an intentional effort at that. Because from our experiences, right, there's always a possibility that a project or any project can create unintentional or intentional negative impacts. And so it's important to ensure that, we're meeting the needs of folks on the ground, and who better to speak about the challenges and the conditionings, right, than the community itself. And so as this source of funding is intended to bring more infrastructure to benefit our communities. How do you measure that, right? How do you know you're meeting the needs of the community and where exactly these investments are going? And so
So
in short,
go ahead. Mhm.
in short, they can inform, right, this process tremendously, and it should definitely be approached in that way. And it's, but it's also not so much of a question of how, it's like the question of when.
So can you walk that through a little bit when you say how and when? That seems like a good thing to explore. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think if we were to look at, I think throughout the history, right, of in the Southeast, there's been many systemic barriers in the past that have kind of created this kind of exclusionary model, where folks are left out of important conversations and decisions that affect their livelihood. And a part of the work that we do in community organizing is moving away from those systems, right? And informing community members of these conversations, right? Particularly when there's so many different chains of profit that's happening in our communities at the expense of our health, and in the environment, right? It's important to kind of, it's important to recognize that there's grassroots movements already happening in Southeast LA to challenge that. And it's necessary to kind of continue that momentum and continue to bring community members in this conversation. And I think in modern times now, there's more of a collective feel and push when it comes to these projects, right? And so it's more of continuing that sentiment.
And I can presume East Yard will play an active role in this conversation going forward as this infrastructure and climate change funding is coming in, right?
Absolutely. I think in any the advocacy, right? The advocacy component of all of this has existed, right, for decades. Whether it's been with Caltrans, right, with Metro, LA County, UTSC, AQMD, is like actively trying to ensure inclusion of our communities when they're more often than not included, right? And so the same applies for looking ahead for these sources of funding. But also, right, I think that it raises the question, what's also being done when there's not funding, right, being proposed on the table.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is, with state funds or not, right, how are folks at the city, county, state, agency level continuing to, actively engage around these issues that we see? And so, there's so many intersectional issues when it comes to the environment. And so when it comes to kind of creating this resiliency factor and self-determination in the Southeast cities, it's a longer commitment than that, right? So it's just recognizing that also.
Elizabeth, what's your take on what Jocelyn's saying about getting that input going forward at the community
Right.
level?
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely important, and she's right. And part of I think my vision on Southeast collaborating, and I briefly touched on it, is it's not just cities collaborating. It should absolutely include some of our nonprofits, our advocates, our residents that are making up these nonprofits and advocacy groups, but even just residents that aren't affiliated, right? In Cudahy, we're trying to include residents in every step of every process. So even our economic development plan included resident input. Every single one of our processes is including community meetings and surveys, and really trying to make sure that we get a feel for what the community wants and including that as part of our final plans. Again, not just on EJ issues, but on every single issue. And I think that in Cudahy, where we've been actively trying to work with organizations like East Yard, work with CBE. CBE has actually been really instrumental in applying to some of these park grants for Cudahy, and we're really winning them and making sure that we're able to upgrade our parks for our residents and increase green space. So yes, absolutely, we need community input at every step of the process. That includes, before we reach out to grants, finding out what type of grants residents want to see, right? Because our residents absolutely want new parks, but when we start talking about new parks, they start saying, what about maintaining our old ones, right? And we know that that's a
Mhm.
lot of money. So maybe the grant funding needs to be focused on that first before we start searching for more parks, or maybe that means multiple collaborations and also funding the nonprofits so that they're able to manage multiple collaborations, right? Because they're also limited staff, and if we're stretching them toward Cudahy, then maybe Maywood gets less love, and we obviously don't want to do that either. So I think it involves a lot of collaboration along the way. I think we're getting to a place where we're able to say that we're communicating more, especially with the support of the SELA Collaborative, right? The SELA Collaborative brings together already so many nonprofits in Southeast Los Angeles. We communicate with them as cities and as elected officials. We definitely I think the next step is really having these working roundtables on different issues, and environmental justice and a green SELA is obviously one of those topics.
It sounds to me a little bit like as people get to know SELA now, and SELA is not the same place, in an activist sense as it was 20 years ago. So for both the governor's office, Edison, the speaker's office, the White House, there's the local elected officials and there's the nonprofit sector are both now playing a really, really active role in kind of shaping the next generation for SELA. So, LaQuinn, what do you think of that in terms of the challenges? And I'm not trying to dump the weight of the world on your shoulders. You've been very, very responsive. It's kind of complicated given that there's, over 480 incorporated places in the state of California. There's big cities, little cities. But to be able to outreach both to the electeds and to the nonprofit and activist sector, what kind of challenges does that create for you? That's not an easy thing to put on your shoulders.
It's not an easy thing, but it's interesting, Rafe, when I was listening to Jocelyn talk, I didn't actually think of it as a challenge. I actually thought of it as a resource. Because again, this focus that we have, or, our desire to make sure that our programs are really, benefiting the people that they're meant to benefit, they're not onerous, that people are, are participating, that we're getting their input. Like, there's always traditionally, been a role for local governments, and I think increasingly, at least for me, the community advocates have been increasingly important in making sure like we're getting that also like the community voice as well. Not to say that we're not getting it from the local government, but to everybody's point that we've heard like repeatedly on this, like we have like very few resources. It's not just at the local government level, at the community level, it's also at the state level, right? We're all working with, bare resources, sometimes minimum resources. And I just really feel like this is a great way to partner on some of the work that we need to do. So again, like I love working with the community groups and with local government. And to me, it's actually a benefit because I get some of that input that I need, right? Things that I wouldn't have been aware of, or even just expanding this like viewpoint perspective on different issues so that I know like when I come out with a product, I can easily say like, okay, I've already checked with so-and-so. Yep, this question you have, like done. And like that helps me move my projects, like keep them going. So I mean, I guess the challenge is because there's a lot of people and sometimes not knowing who to reach out to, right? Or, because there are quite a few community groups, sometimes not knowing, like, did I reach out to the right one? Should I be reaching out to this one also? Are they adequately relaying what this community wants? And so sometimes you have to do multiple community groups that you're outreaching to. But again, like, I appreciate getting all of this diversity of thought and perspective into our processes.
Well, that's just great. And that's kind of what the speaker said at the beginning. He said, somebody said, this room is too big. And he said, no, the previous room was too small. I mean, the room has to be bigger. I would like to alert both of you, the governor's office and Edison, that you're getting a lot of things in the Q&A about looking for ways to collaborate and asking questions that maybe people hadn't thought of before, now that they have a better sense of what's out there and how accessible you're all going to be. So I would keep an eye on those. Rosalie, what's your take on this so far about the back and forth of both local government and the nonprofit and activist sector, which I think is actually very exciting. But it sounds like you're already working with various organizations who are not even in local government. So you're not new to this.
But we can always learn and improve, right?
Mhm.
And so that's where, again, where these conversations are so helpful. And even, I think the chat and the questions are evident of that, right? Where we try to reach out as best we can and engage, but, to the extent that there are communities or there are organizations we're missing, conversations like this help identify them. So I think it's incredibly helpful. And, we have like our clean energy access working group that we are a part of, but we have other critical community-based organizations and governments that are part of that too. So that's, there are different coalitions and working groups that come together to also talk about these issues. So I think those, to continue those are really important.
And Justin, what are your thoughts going forward from what you're hearing from everybody else on the panel? Does it make you see a path forward for how this process could work?
I think there has to be, right?
Yep.
I think for us, it's mostly of a sense of urgency, and as folks that are living, where there's a lot of these intersectional impacts, right? We're seeing the brunt of the pollution in our communities. I think since we come in with this sense of urgency, right? But the sense of, we need to move forward. We need to move forward, and so that's kind of where my head's at with that.
Well, that urgency reminds me of Elizabeth talking about calling every morning and every night to say that there's a smell which is probably going to be damaging to public health. And that should not be happening. I mean, there's just no question that should not be happening. And to think that this conversation could be helping to get some resources in that could be applied in a really targeted way is kind of exciting. I'd like to suggest that we take a few minutes together to look at some of the questions. Loving the conversation. It's just great to hear from all four of you, just with such valuable stuff. And people seem to like hearing from you too. I'm noticing on the Q&A, you're getting good movie reviews for the conversation. There was a question about extreme heat, which is on everybody's mind right now. And I'm wondering, when you look at I can't get the word trillion out of my head, Luquin. I'm trying, but I just can't shake that word trillion. Extreme heat is experienced differentially. It's not evenly distributed where it is. And SELA is really suffering from that. What's in these various packages that can help once it gets really down to the grassroots level about extreme heat?
Yeah. So, gosh, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head.
Don't worry about the numbers, just kind of, is it being addressed? Is there some potential to address that in all this?
Yes, there's definitely funding for extreme heat. And I wish my colleague, Amanda Hansen, was on. She's Deputy Secretary for Climate at the Resources Agency. And so she's focused a lot on the extreme heat. And like I was mentioning, like we just put out this, maybe I don't know if it was just put out, maybe, but within the last, I gotta say month, I know time goes by so quickly, but we just put out this extreme heat action plan. And so really looking at actions, to address the extreme heat that you get in a lot of these urban communities, right? I think on the energy side, I've been focusing a lot on grid resiliency and reliability, but there's the other side of it too, which is the extreme heat aspect, the natural and working lands. So Amanda's really focused on that. So let me find the link to the Extreme Heat Action Plan.
That would be just great.
Put it in the chat. That's definitely a resource, definitely something that, the Resources Agency is thinking about. Secretary Crowfoot, who leads our agency, he is very supportive of the Extreme Heat Action Plan, is always trying to think of ways of, addressing extreme heat in these communities. What else can we do? How else can we be innovative, right? In addressing this, just understanding that it's a huge burden to these communities.
Elizabeth, have you been giving thought to this issue? Obviously, I would assume you're thinking about it and hearing from constituents about it as well.
Absolutely. In this last heat wave this summer, we had Elizabeth Learning Center and Bell High School students both experiencing just extreme heat issues. And it was the extreme heat outside, but obviously in their classroom, it's felt even higher, just with the air they're breathing. And both schools had air conditioning units that were going out. In Bell High School, they have not replaced that AC units system, HVAC system since '86, I believe. I didn't exist then. And so just to kind of put it in perspective of how long it's been. And so although obviously air conditioning is not the solution for extreme heat issues, we see that there's just this constant system of underfunding SELA communities. It meant, extreme heat came from underfunding in terms of like climate resiliency and having us be ready with tree canopy, with street systems that look better and feel better in terms of extreme heat conditions. But then that translates into our school systems not being ready to take on extreme heat situations. Then that translates into our kids not being able to learn, not feeling well, not going to school maybe because of it. And now it's this entire sort of just a chain of events that affects our communities, right? And so we should be thinking about it in Cudahy, we're thinking about it in terms of tree canopy. The conversation actually started with elementary school age children, and one of our great organizations, California Walks, led a community walk with, again, little kids, 7, 8-year-olds, and they walked through the streets of Cudahy and said, how do you feel? What are you thinking as you walk through the street? And of course, little kids pointed out, sidewalk is broken, but they were also like, it's kind of hot. We should get more trees. And we got that input from little children, right? And so it's one of my favorite stories in terms of how we get community input, because it's such true community input that translates into real policy, into what we should be looking for in grant funding. And it came from little ones. So that's just one example of how we're looking at it and how it affects our communities as a whole. It's not just saying it's really hot and that's affecting our climate justice work and just how we feel, but it affects our little children in terms of their education at the end of the day.
Thank you. Rosalie, if a school district wanted to reach out to Edison for a project that could help in this area, and I know that's not all Edison type of stuff, people are talking about, redoing schoolyards that are too much concrete and it's just too hot to go out and play and fix that. Is that something that could a school district work with you on the air conditioning and other issues that are being talked about? Is that in your bailiwick? I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I'll ask my team to add in some information into the chat here, but we do have energy efficiency programs that look at, how do we reduce the energy consumption, when it comes to HVAC systems, what are the type of systems, that we see that could be more energy efficient, right? So I know that we do work with schools on such projects like that.
That'd be great. That'd be exciting. Justin, what have you, I'm sure you've been working on the extreme heat question and where it fits in. And once again, a reminder that no matter what we read in the news, extreme heat effects are not evenly distributed everywhere. So we just know that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a reality that we see every year, right? And at increasing periods of the year. I think Elizabeth mentioned, we see that there is this need, right, to open up certain centers in our communities to help alleviate these the heat strains that our community members are facing. A lot of elders, a lot of folks that are in apartment units, a lot of children. And this has to do a lot with, it questions, right, like where we're going in terms of resilience planning, right? But also it also emphasizes that continued need to be pushing back against what is also causing these heat impacts, right? And so it's that increased pollution that we're seeing in our communities, which is why we continue to, we clash a lot with the ports of LA and Long Beach, right? And the 50 to 60,000 trucks we see passing by the 710 corridor, the polluting industries, right? So it's a constant effort, on our end, but also across other folks in the community, right? To be addressing are trying to address these issues at the root, but also advocating for more resilient infrastructure, right, to be able to alleviate these growing strains, right?
I'm so glad you raised the ports, because that was the last question I was going to ask this group. By the way, I could listen to the four of you all day. So sooner or later, we're going to stop, but I'm just finding it so informative. The ports of LA and Long Beach, the question was asked, and of course, we're talking about the 710 corridor, and that all has to do with the ports. What's one thing that could really make a huge difference in the impact of this pollution in Southeast LA? And I'm not asking for expertise. I'm not asking for, a technical thought, but just what do you think is, if we could put all of our energy into one thing, and since you raised it, let's go back to you, Justin. What's one thing that could really make a difference?
Well, it's more than one thing, I think. But I think one important, and this kind of goes to another question on the chat in terms of upcoming, legislation. But there is movement with the California Air Resources Board to advance clean trucks, right? The Advanced Clean Truck and Advanced Clean Fleets rule that determines when diesel trucks need to transition, right, to zero emission. And setting those timelines and parameters. And for us, it was kind of making sure that, they feel the urgency of frontline communities that are feeling these impacts, right? And so I think really trying to advocate and move forward a just transition, right? To advance zero emissions, to see, to clean up our air, right? And not have to see family members and friends continue to get sick and losing years out of our lives. And so I think that's one of the approaches that I could think of right now. There's many.
Thanks. Rosalie, what would be at the top of your list? And it can be the same thing. It's okay. It's just
Yeah, and it mostly is to what Jocelyn's saying. It's, really electrification, right? Transportation is one of the biggest contributors to not just climate change, but our, the state of our air quality in the surrounding neighborhoods there. So, electrification of that corridor is critical. And Edison is working with, the port and large fleets to try to help, in that transition. And we know that there are active projects right now for a large fleet of the goods movement trucks, so the large heavy duty trucks, to look at some of the electric vehicles, in that category. And so we're working with them to identify charging hubs that'll allow them, to charge up to 100 miles, through that freight corridor. So, really helping to support the electrification of that corridor is critical, not just the charging infrastructure, but also, in helping, with obtaining incentives for the electric vehicles, but the grid resiliency too. And I think LaQuinn and Jocelyn also mentioned that the grid resiliency being a critical and part of that, making sure that we are aware of some of the larger electric needs. We're making sure that our grid is able to support the transition as well.
Thank you. I think it's probably unanimous, so I think I probably won't make everybody else jump on and say that. But I want to bring on Wilma Franco, and I'd like you four to keep your cameras on. I'm just adding Wilma to the mix. For those of you who don't know Dr. Wilma Franco, who is, of course, Wilma, is the executive director of the SELA Collaborative, has just done a wonderful job running that organization. And we're so proud as board members to have Wilma. Wilma, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rafe.
And it's nice that you spent time at the beach while you're doing this. In the early days of our being on Zoom, I was constantly persuaded that people were actually in Hawaii when I was talking to them. And now I've finally understood that that's probably not true. So, Wilma, what's your take on what you've heard so far? I mean, what are your thoughts about this?
I found this conversation just so inspiring. I hope that, everybody that's listening, right, is encouraged by this dialogue taking place. I think I hear a lot of common themes, right, as I hear the conversation. I think for us, this conversation is really exciting and important because we know that it's a priority not only to our organization, but also all of the leaders across the Southeast region, right? And for us, it's directly aligned with our SELA agenda. Our agenda was co-created, right, with a number of leaders, a little over 80 leaders in the Southeast, right? And today's dialogue really reminded me of the policy areas around environmental justice, economic recovery, and regional advocacy work, right? I think one of the things that we heard from a lot of our leaders, right, is that while a lot of us understand the health impact of the 710 and how it's impacted our communities, it continues to be one of those unresolved equity issues in LA County, right? And how that's really being addressed, right? And then so I think for us, as we also think about the economic recovery and the future prosperity of SELA, we understand that it's going to require, right, a lot of investment and resources for a region that has historically been under-resourced, right, and neglected. And then so how do we do that collectively? I think one of the things that I heard that I was just really inspired by was referencing things like regional capacity building, collaboration, partnerships, a lot of the work that I think we've all been leading collectively, but also the need to do this across sectors, right? We can't do this alone. We cannot do this without the elected officials, without our cities. We all have a little role to play, right? Some of us have a bigger role. But I think the one thing that I heard loud and clear is the role that our community plays, right? And I know we've often heard in the past, right? Like nothing for us without us. And that's truly what SELA is saying, right? Our communities need to be at the table as we think about how do we invest, how do we bring resources, what's prioritized, because at the end of the day, who's being impacted the most are those communities that are living in this, in their region, right? And so I was just really inspired by this conversation, Rafe.
Well, good, Wilma. Happy to hear that. I am too. Wilma, when you think of a green future for SELA, what does that actually mean to you? What picture's in your mind 10 years from now?
Yeah.
What's that thing in your head about that?
Yeah, so I think for us, right, as we think about, just the future, a green future, I think it makes me think of systems change, right? And it makes me think of the quality of life that our community has in SELA, right? Because a lot of the work and a lot of the things that we're alluding to is a lot of these, whether it's environmental, we can, have conversations around IIJA without having conversations about health and how it impacts health, about, access to income, right? The workforce development opportunities in SELA that exist or don't exist, capacity building across our cities and our nonprofits. So all of these things are interconnected, right? So when I think about the future, it has to be a future where we're really what I think is going to require us to really get on the same page on issues like equity, right? Because we talk about equity, but I think we all talk about equity from a different perspective. And there's, I've had this conversation with Mayor Villaraigosa when we engage on the infrastructure conversation, right? And I said, how is the governor defining equity, right? Because it may look different across different regions and across different communities. So having an understanding of what that looks like, it's important, and it needs to be informed by community.
I'm going to ask each of you the same question as we get toward the end of our conversation, which is when you envision the best green future for SELA, what are the pieces of that? So Elizabeth, let me start with you. What does that actually look like?
The pieces, community engagement, collaboration amongst agencies and groups and everyone, dollars and action. Those are the pieces I would say.
Good. So, LaQuinn, what about you? When you think about it, what's the thing that's in your head that would be a great outcome of all this?
So, I think of all the things that, that Elizabeth and Wilma have said when I think of a green transition, but the other big thing that I think about too, which is really important for me, and I think is key for having a successful green transition, is conversation. And I say conversation more in terms of, being able to, like, when I think about energy, the energy transition or green transition, like there's a bunch of agencies that work, within the resources agency that I get to work with. And so they all have different pieces of this green transition, and it touches on something that, Rosalie and Jocelyn were saying too, in terms of like the interconnectedness of all of these sectors, right? Talking about transitioning to, electric vehicles. Well, you can't do that until you have the charging infrastructure in place, until you have like incentives in place for people to even buy those vehicles, right? So when I say conversation, what I mean is having an open dialogue around what a green transition means for multiple sectors, so from different perspectives, and coming to consensus around, okay, you know what, like from this perspective, like this is what is a priority, from this other perspective, this is a priority. So how do I balance those, right? And help me get to a solution that everybody's happy with, but also is done in such a way that we are successful in this green transition. Because again, having everybody, automatically switch over to an EV when we don't have that charging infrastructure in place, like that's not helpful, right? Or putting all the charging infrastructure in place, but not having the dollars for people to purchase EVs, that also doesn't really work, right? Or even thinking about, I guess the conversation about like the 710 corridor, right? Like even where you're placing that charging infrastructure, like all of these are pieces of this conversation we need to be having. But again, there's just so many different pieces of this puzzle that like I'm thinking through. For me, the biggest thing is this conversation in general, just being able to have it.
Very well said. Rosalie, when you visualize a green future for SELA, what does it look like to you? What are the pieces of it?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to repeat a little bit of what everyone has said here, is that proactive engagement and, inclusiveness, right? As we, think and plan out this transition, to the clean energy. So for SCE, what matters most is that we're capturing the perspective of what a green SELA looks like to the residents of SELA, right? So this is, I think, a little bit of what, everyone has said already. But making sure that we understand that and we're including them in that transition, we're doing this all together proactively, not after the fact. And, we're helping to work together to build that future.
Thank you. Jocelyn, what about you? What's your vision of a green future? What does it look like?
Yeah, it looks like a lot of things. It looks like self-sustenance, mutual support. It looks like no displacement. It looks like divesting from fossil fuels and other systems of harm. And it looks like more resources going to community members directly. And not many people like when this observation is brought up, but even internally within Southeast cities, when looking at city budgets, right? Half, if not a little bit more or a little bit under than half of all of the city funds go to, police departments, for example. And so what does it look like reimagining, getting funds for building systems of resilience, right? When we're talking about these things. So green spaces, food sovereignty, ensuring we have access to safe water, air quality improvements, green jobs, clean renewable energy, and so on. So all of these things, but also community members being able to stay and enjoy these things. That's what a green future looks like.
It sounds like you're all describing not just a technically green future, but a very democratically, with a small d, designed future, which are not always the same thing. And this conversation, by the way, leaves me very optimistic.
Rafe, can I just add one
thing? Of course.
As I was hearing the conversation, right, and hearing everybody's feedback, I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight is this idea of accessibility, right? Because I think it also speaks to capacity building, not only for our cities, right? Because we can easily say like, oh, we'll make this proposal or this grant available to you, accessible to you, but what does that mean, right? Because as Liz mentioned, right, like there's technical assistance needs. It's the same for our community, right? And I think one of the things that I try to always highlight, especially as we think about green jobs and green economy, right, is how is this something that's going to be accessible to all community members, right? I specifically highlight, our community members that may not have any formal education, because how do we transition them into these new jobs, right? Because it does impact their quality of life. So I think, how we define these terms and why, I think we're so, focus on community needs to be at the table, right, is because we really need to be able to push each other on this idea of expertise, and we may be content experts, but our community members are the context experts, and we need both in order to create a better future.
And that's a reminder that this is not a simple upward chart that just goes very smoothly without obstacles and entrenched interests and conflicts over that. I mean, this is going to be something that's going to be kind of worked through over many years to come. A few things, a few closing notes. One is we have recorded this, so hopefully people will have a chance to listen to this conversation. I leave this conversation thinking that if the people on this call were to sit down, they could probably solve 90% of the problems that we have, but you've all been wonderful and really have contributed a great deal. I have a few thank yous. One is to the SELA Collaborative and Wilma and the Leadership Network that she always brings to the table. Another is our own Pat Brown Institute staff, which works very hard to make these webinars very smooth. And Edison for being such a great partner in sort of co-developing this event. And I really want to thank Alex Esparza, Monica Nunez, and Irma Garacino, all of whom I believe were signed on to the call. Thank you all very much. It's been fun to work with you for these many months. And to all of you who not only showed up for this, but sent in questions and comments, and then people started posting reports that they had. It's been a very lively and engaging conversation. So thank you all, and thank you to our panelists especially, and our introducers, and Speaker Rendon, and Larry, and everybody who really, I think, made this a very informative event. So I believe with that, we will say our goodbyes, and thank you all for participating.